Today I want to talk about Plato on oligarchy, rule by the wealthy. Last time we talked about timocracy, that is to say, a rule based on honor and shame, in a culture where honor is the greatest thing to be valued, and the shame of other people is the thing to be avoided. Rule in such a society, he says, is going to have certain kinds of advantages, but it's not ideal. The spirited element of the soul and of the state is going to be in control. Emotions usually work together with reason, so this isn't entirely terrible, but it's not ideal either, because emotion, the spirited element in these cases, although it may ultimately be directed in a way that is compatible with reason, nevertheless is not really directed by reason. And so over time, you can expect there to be a divergence and things to get worse. Now, that is directly what leads to oligarchy. Because Plato says, after all, what leads to the dissolution of the ideal state and produces timocracy in the first place is the declining virtue and the growing greed of the rulers. Successively, people who are entirely virtuous, who do manage to control their desires and their emotions by reason, are replaced by people who are less virtuous, who have reason less in control. And initially, the spirited element is still strong enough to be able to predominate. But over time, it weakens, and desire becomes more significant. The quest for wealth begins to drive more than the quest for honor. Even in a timocracy, where honor manages to maintain first place, the desire for wealth, the desire for material possessions, grows stronger and stronger, and eventually it takes over. So it is impossible without the full guidance of reason for the spirited element to maintain its predominance. Instead, desire becomes more significant and eventually overtakes it. So the oligarchic soul is one that has competing elements. It has the spirited element, it has reason, it has desire. Desire now is strong, and it cannot be dominated, cannot be controlled or even directed by reason. And so we've got these separate elements competing for control. Well, in an oligarchic society, it's the same way. We end up with a kind of class struggle between the rich and the poor. So an oligarchy is one where people become more and more concerned with economic considerations, with wealth, with greed, and with the kind of resentments that build up over time as society divides into different classes. Recall that in a timocracy, a society controlled by a love of honor, those who rule will be high-spirited, they will be high-minded in a way, but they're also going to be avaricious. They're also going to be concerned with wealth. After all, if you're really concerned with honor, what's an easy way to gain the honor and the esteem of others? It's to be wealthy. And so initially, wealth appeals primarily as a way of attaining honor. It becomes a path to honor, and in many ways, and for many people, an easier path than the path of virtue and accomplishment. So for some, it may be that attaining wealth is impossible. For many, it may be very, very difficult, but for some, it will come easily. And so it will be an easy path to honor. And increasingly, the society will start valuing those who it honors on the basis of their wealth. So over time, a desire for wealth starts becoming predominant, initially as a means to honor, but eventually for its own sake. It starts strengthening and appealing to desire, and in effect strengthening the desire part of the soul, the appetitive element, at the expense of the spirited element, and consequently at the expense of reason. So over time, wealth becomes more and more people's main concern, the thing they desire for its own sake. And that leads increasingly to trouble. The rulers not only try to attain wealth, but they find ways of spending the public money for themselves, channeling it toward themselves, toward their own interests. And so people find that the society and its leadership are increasingly not focused on the good of the society at large, not focused on the good of the people, not focused on the good of the state, but instead focused on the good of the rulers themselves. They are going to direct the public treasury and, in general public policy, to enrich and empower themselves. And so we get this increasing class divide in such a society between the rich and the poor. The rich become powerful, the powerful become rich, and everybody else is left to the side. Now, it might be not so terrible if those who were wealthy and those who were powerful had as their main focus the good of the state. But at this point, they don't. They seek to aggrandize and empower and enrich themselves. And there's very little concern for the rest of the public. Oh, there's lip service. There is a desire to maintain the esteem and, frankly, the acquiescence of the poor. But nevertheless, there's no real concern for their welfare. The main focus is simply on greater riches, greater power for those already in charge. The leadership increasingly becomes an elite that serves the interests of the leadership and not the interests of the people. Now, having the wealthy in charge of a society means trouble for a variety of reasons. Initially, there's an obvious reason. Would you put the richest person on board an airplane in charge of flying the airplane? Obviously not. Would you take the richest person on the ship and make them captain of the ship? Well, no. How about the richest person in the society? Would you make them general of the army? No. They are unlikely to have the specialized knowledge and skills needed to perform those tasks. So when you take the richest people in society and put them in positions of power, or you take people in the positions of power and make them serve not the public interest, but largely their own power and their own wealth, you get trouble. You get inferior piloting of the state. And so, just as we would not want somebody flying a plane, or captaining a boat, or in general in charge of an army, simply on the basis of their wealth, so we don't really want people like that in charge of an entire society. We're going to get inferior leadership. Well, the result of inferior leadership, as well as this sense that those in charge no longer have the interests of the people at heart, is going to mean that the rest of the society feels very little obligation to actually obey the rulers. And so we not only get a class struggle and a class divide between the rich and the poor, we also have the vast majority of people in society no longer feeling any sense of moral obligation to follow the law, to follow the leaders. Instead, they're going to feel as if this is an alien regime imposed upon them, almost as if a foreign power had conquered them. And so we get a divide here that is not only a material divide, but a deep moral divide. The leaders claim a kind of authority that the people no longer are willing to recognize or grant them. And that produces a situation of serious political instability. It causes a great deal of trouble. In a high-trust society, people tend to feel an obligation toward one another. They feel an obligation to obey the law, a moral obligation, as well as simply a legal obligation or a practical obligation. It's not just, I might get in trouble if I get caught, but instead it would be wrong for me to violate the law. When that's lost, something very serious in society is lost, and order begins to break down. And that's what happens in an oligarchic society. So Socrates says that an oligarchic city would of necessity be not one but two, a city of the rich and a city of the poor, dwelling together and always plotting against one another. Now that undermines the ability of the state to wage war, to conduct foreign policy, or, for that matter, public policy within its own borders. It becomes a state of wealthy people and a state of paupers. And they have very little in common. They don't see themselves as involved in a common enterprise any longer. So there is no sense any longer left in the society that there is a common enterprise, a common goal, a common criterion of success, or a common motivation that can hold this society together. So the entire society begins to have the sense that it's not one society but two. And at that point, things begin to break down completely. Part of the reason it breaks down, and part of the symptom of its breaking down, is a growing criminal class. If people no longer feel a sense of moral obligation to follow the law, an increasing number will not follow the law. So the increase in crime is a sure sign of this kind of oligarchic society. When people no longer feel that those in positions of leadership have any concern for them, when they feel alienated from them and feel as if the laws are there to promote the interests of the wealthy and powerful rather than their interests or the interests of the society at large. And so a growing criminal class emerges. It's a sure sign that the society is no longer one, but several. It is now breaking apart into its various components, since there is no longer anything that unifies it. This corresponds to a state of the soul. Reason is struggling against desire. Desire is struggling against the spirited element. The spirited element is even fighting reason. The parts of the soul are coming apart. They are now in tension and in conflict rather than working together. Jonathan Lear puts it very powerfully and very poetically in this passage. A pathological psyche is not, in fact, a psyche, but various psychic parts. So, for example, just as an oligarchy is not a polis, but two parts, a rich part and a poor part, so an oligarchical psyche is, in fact, two psychic parts, a ruling part and a ruled. For Plato, there is not sufficient integration in the functioning of the parts for them to count as a genuine unity, a psyche. The oligarchical person is, says Plato, diplus tis, someone double. For Plato, being double is a way of not being an integrated person. It is a divided and conflicted existence. He says of the oligarchic person, when the appetites come knocking on the door of his psyche, they find no one is at home. That's the case in the state at large as well. No one is at home. There is no longer any sense of integration, of it any longer being one state, one polis, one society. Instead, we've got various classes vying against one another. We have the leadership class, concerned with its own welfare. We have the mass of people who are concerned with just getting by and surviving, no longer feeling any moral obligation toward the leaders or any identification with them. And finally, we have a criminal class that grows up seeking its own wealth, its own power, its own survival, depending on circumstances, even at the expense of other people who are poor, who are out of power, simply because it no longer feels any sense of obligation to the society at large. And that means not only any moral sense to follow the law or to obey the commands of the leaders, it means no moral regard for anybody, rich or poor, leader or follower. And so the result is that we get a society divided into these various parts that are hostile to one another and that prey on one another. The result of that is, well, a high degree of instability. It can't last for very long. And indeed, it doesn't.